the US dollar is going to collapse. It sounds like a crazy thing to say, right? Like something from a disaster movie. But what if I told you that the system that keeps your entire life stable, the dollar's position, as the world's most important currency, is slowly, fatally crumbling right now? The reality is the dollar is no longer just a piece of paper. It's the fuel for the global economy. It's what countries use to buy oil, to trade, and to hold in their biggest savings accounts. But for the last 50 years, the United States has been abusing that power, printing trillions of dollars with almost zero consequence. But now the consequences are finally arriving, and they are catastrophic. This isn't about some minor economic downturn. This is about the death of the dollar's global power and the terrifying world that comes after it. We're going to break down the one core reason this is happening and why the fallout is going to crush the American economy and permanently change your life unless you know exactly what to look for. The story of the dollar's death starts with a single massive pillar that holds it up, the petrodollar. Most people think the dollar is strong because the U.S. has a big economy or a strong military. Those things help, sure. But the real power comes from a secret deal made back in the 1970s. This deal created a system called the petrodollar, and it is the single most important and now most vulnerable piece of the puzzle. Think of it this way. Almost every country in the world needs oil to run their cars, power their factories, and heat their homes. In the early 1970s, after a period of extreme economic instability, the U.S. made an arrangement with Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest oil producer. The deal was simple but absolutely game-changing. Saudi Arabia would agree to sell its oil only in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. would offer military protection for the Saudi kingdom. Why was this so crucial? Because if every nation, from Germany to Japan to China, had to buy oil and they could only buy it in U.S. dollars, they were forced to constantly keep a massive stash of dollars on hand. They couldn't just use their local currency, like the yen or the euro. They had to sell their goods to the world to get dollars and then use those dollars to buy the oil they needed. This created a non-stop artificial global demand for the dollar. It didn't matter how much the U.S. government spent or how much debt it piled up. The world needed those dollars. This petrodollar system allowed the United States to print money to fund its massive government spending without causing the kind of fatal inflation that would doom any other country. Because all those extra printed dollars were immediately sent overseas to buy oil, keeping American prices low and American living standards artificially high. It was, effectively, a license for the United States to print money and use the rest of the world as a gigantic, invisible savings account. And that license is now being revoked. The pillar is cracking. To understand why the world is finally ready to move away from the dollar, we have to look at the history of how the dollar became the world's reserve currency in the first place and where the first fatal mistake was made. For many years, the dollar was tied to gold. This was the system put in place by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. Under this agreement, the U.S. dollar was officially pegged to gold at a price of $35 per ounce. Crucially, all other major world currencies were then pegged to the U.S. dollar. This meant that the dollar was as good as gold. Other countries felt safe holding dollars because they knew they could theoretically redeem those dollars for a fixed amount of physical gold from the U.S. government. This trust made the dollar the ultimate global safe haven. But American politicians and the Federal Reserve began to abuse this trust. As the U.S. spent huge amounts of money on the Vietnam War and on various expensive government programs in the 1960s, they had to print more and more dollars. The number of printed dollars in circulation began to wildly outpace the amount of gold held in the U.S. Treasury. This was the beginning of the fatal misstep. Foreign governments and central banks started to notice that there were far more dollars floating around than there was gold to back them up, and they started to get nervous. A speculative crisis began. Countries like France realized the U.S. didn't actually have enough gold to cover all the dollars it had printed. So the French government, in a now famous historical act, started sending warships loaded with US dollars back to New York, demanding their gold back. They didn't want the paper money, they wanted the real asset. Other countries quickly started to follow their lead. It was a classic bank run, but on a global scale, and the US was quickly running out of gold. The crisis hit a peak in 1971, in a shocking move that fundamentally changed the global financial system forever. President Richard Nixon went on television and announced that the U.S. was unilaterally closing the gold window. This meant the U.S. would no longer allow foreign governments to exchange their dollars for gold. The fixed link between the dollar and gold was broken. In that single moment, the dollar went from a currency backed by a physical, tangible asset, gold, to a fiat currency backed by nothing more than the simple promise and confidence in the U.S. government. This was the most important decision in modern financial history. The dollar was now doomed to an existence dependent entirely on the world's trust, and that trust has been completely eroded by the next stage of the story, the printing press addiction. After 1971, the U.S. government essentially had a magic money machine. With the gold anchor gone, and the petrodollar system forcing the world to use the dollar anyway, there was nothing to stop the Federal Reserve from printing whatever amount of money it felt was necessary. And they took that power and ran with it. They did not just run with it. They sprinted, and they did so with an urgency that now appears completely fatal. The first major time the world saw the sheer scale of the Fed's new power was during the 2008 financial crisis, when the housing market collapsed, threatening to take down the entire global banking system. The Federal Reserve stepped in with a new tool they called quantitative easing, or QE. This was just a fancy, deliberately complicated word for printing money. To bail out the banks, the Fed created trillions of new dollars out of thin air and used them to buy up assets like government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from those very same banks. This created a precedent. Anytime the economy faced a crisis, even one caused by bad behavior from the banks themselves, the Fed would simply print more money. They socialized the debt, meaning they made the public pay for the mistakes of the private banks, and they privatized the profits. But the 2008 money printing was nothing compared to the 2020 COVID crisis. When the global economy ground to a halt, the Federal Reserve went into hyperdrive. In just 2 years, they printed roughly $4.5 trillion. That is more money created in 2 years than in the entire century before it. They blew up their balance sheet, the amount of assets they held, bought with freshly printed cash, from about $4 trillion to almost $9 trillion. Think about the sheer scale of that number, $4.5 trillion. This money didn't go into the hands of ordinary people. It flowed straight into the financial system, allowing banks, investment funds, and the already wealthy to buy assets like stocks and real estate. This is the exact mechanism that caused the housing prices to skyrocket, the stock market to surge, and your own cost of living to become completely unaffordable. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply math. When you increase the money supply by 50% in 2 years, you permanently devalue every dollar that already existed. You are, in effect, robbing everyone who held a dollar and giving that wealth to the people who owned assets. This reckless printing of money is the reason that foreign governments are finally losing faith in the dollar. Why would any nation hold trillions of dollars in their national savings when they know that a handful of unelected officials at the U.S. Federal Reserve can decide at any moment to print more and instantly dilute the value of those savings? This brings us to the most urgent, fatal part of the dollar story, the global resistance. The world has seen the U.S. use the dollar not just as a currency, but as a weapon. Every time the U.S. prints massive amounts of money, it hurts the savings of every country that holds dollars. But even more dangerously, the U.S. has used the dollar-based global payment system to punish countries it disagrees with by cutting them off from the system entirely, what we call sanctions. The most famous example is the sanctions placed on Russia after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The US and its allies froze hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian assets held in foreign banks. For every other country in the world, especially those who do not always agree with US foreign policy, like China, India, and Brazil, this was a massive, terrifying wake-up call. The message was clear. If you cross the US, they can instantly confiscate your national savings. This was the spark that ignited the final stage of de-dollarization. No country wants its economic future held hostage by another nation's foreign policy decisions, so they are actively looking for a way out. This is where the BRICS group comes in. BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a group of major emerging economies. They have been quietly and now very openly working on creating alternative trading systems that bypass the US dollar entirely. China, for example, is making massive trade deals with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries to buy oil and natural gas using their own currency, the yuan, instead of the dollar. In 2023, China and Brazil signed a deal to use their local currencies for trade, completely cutting out the dollar as the middleman. Russia and India are trading commodities like oil using the Indian rupee. These are not small fringe deals. They are the biggest economies in the developing world actively, systematically tearing down the petrodollar pillar that has supported the U.S. economy for 50 years. When a country decides to stop using the dollar, it doesn't just mean a change in a bank ledger. It means that country no longer needs to hold a massive reserve of dollars. They start selling those dollars and buying assets that they feel are safer, like gold, or maybe the currency of a trusted trading partner. This massive sell-off of dollars starts the doomed process of the dollar's global collapse. The most fatal part of this entire story is what happens when this global resistance succeeds and the world decides it no longer needs the US dollar as its reserve currency. This is the climax of the situation, and it will be devastating for every person living in the United States. Right now, because the world needs dollars for trade, the US dollar is the strongest currency in the world. This allows the US government to live like a billionaire who never has to pay his own bills. They can borrow money, meaning they can print money at incredibly low interest rates because the whole world is lining up to hold on to those dollars. But when the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, all of that changes overnight. Here's the simple, terrifying consequence. The world will send all of those excess dollars back home. The trillions of dollars that were previously held safely overseas will come flooding back into the American economy. What happens when you suddenly inject trillions of dollars into a country that already has a debt addiction? Hyperinflation. The value of the dollar will absolutely plummet. The prices of everything, groceries, gas, clothing, cars, will skyrocket to levels that make the current inflation look like a joke. Your $100 bill will suddenly buy what $50 or maybe even $20 used to buy. Your paycheck will not keep up. Your savings will be wiped out. This is the ultimate crisis the country is heading toward. Furthermore, the U.S. government will no longer be able to borrow money cheaply. Foreign governments will not be lining up to buy U.S. debt, treasury bonds, if those bonds are paid back in a rapidly devaluing currency. This means the U.S. government will have to offer incredibly high interest rates to convince anyone to lend them money. Imagine this. The government has to raise interest rates from their current levels to maybe 8%, 10%, or even 15% just to pay its massive debt interest. This will cause the entire financial system to seize up. It would make it nearly impossible for you to get a loan for a house or a car. Mortgage rates would skyrocket, causing the housing market to absolutely collapse. The U.S. government will be forced to make impossible choices. Either default on its debt, which would be a global catastrophe, or slash funding for almost every government program, from Social Security to military spending. The current American way of life, built on cheap credit, cheap imports, and the dollar's global dominance, is doomed if the dollar loses its reserve status. Living standards will fall rapidly, poverty will rise, and the American economy will face a fatal reckoning for decades of reckless money printing. This is the climax. The moment the world pushes back and forces the U.S. to live within its means, and the result is a massive, painful collapse in American purchasing power. So let's wrap this up. The dollar is facing a fatal challenge, and it's not a single thing, but a three-part mechanism. First, the fatal flaw was created in 1971 when the U.S. broke the link to gold, allowing the Federal Reserve to print money without any real limits. Second, the printing addiction saw the U.S. government flood the world with trillions of dollars in 2008 and 2020, destroying the value of everyone's savings and demonstrating that the U.S. is not a trustworthy financial manager. And third, the global resistance led by groups like BRICS is actively working to dismantle the petrodollar system, forcing the world to trade in other currencies and sending all those extra dollars flooding back home. When that flood hits, the resulting hyperinflation will be a crisis for American households. You need to understand this mechanism now because your financial future depends on seeing this huge shift coming. Don't miss the next video that explains how to protect your money from the dollar's decline.